Muy bien, buenas tardes a todos y todas. Mi nombre es Angélica Redberg, yo soy profesora del Departamento de Ciencia Política de la Universidad de los Andes y tengo el enorme placer de dar instalación a esta segunda de tres sesiones sobre reconciliación, quiénes, cuándo y cómo, reflexión que estamos adelantando entre colegas de la Universidad del Rosario y la Universidad de los Andes con apoyo y financiación de Activoca. La semana pasada tuvimos el primer encuentro que contó con la participación de Hugo van der Merwe, quien es un experto surafricano en este tema y quien además es editor de la revista internacional sobre justicia transicional. Contamos también con Pamina Firchoff, perdón, Hugo nos hizo un recuento de lo que son los principales avances en los estudios sobre la reconciliación. En segundo lugar, contamos con un trabajo de Pamina Firchoff, Peter Dixon y Fiorella Vera Adriansen, quienes trabajan el tema de los indicadores de la cotidianidad para medir a partir del nivel muy micro las dinámicas de la reconciliación. Y concluimos con un trabajo que estamos adelantando Juan Esteban Ugarriza, yo y varias colegas en torno a las dinámicas de la reconciliación en contextos marcados por continuidades en las violencias entre conflicto armado y post-acuerdo. Hoy tenemos el gusto de continuar. Les quiero dar un par de instrucciones primero. Sepan que este evento cuenta con traducción simultánea, de manera que quienes prefieran escucharlo en inglés eh, pueden hacer. En segundo lugar, es importante que sepan que va a ser grabado también, de tal suerte que si no logran verlo completo o si definitivamente quieren recomendárselo a alguien, lo pueden hacer. Más adelante, por las mismas redes por las cuales se enteraron de este evento, van a poder tener la oportunidad de recibir también la información de la grabación. En contados instantes voy a mandar por el chat un documento de habeas data para que por favor lo consulten y lo revisen. Y finalmente me parece importante decirles también que sepan que, bueno, este evento también está siendo transmitido en vivo por YouTube, por el YouTube de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales de la Universidad de los Andes. Y por último, es importante que sepan que todas las contribuciones que los diferentes y las diferentes autoras han hecho sobre este tema en la sesión pasada, en esta y en la próxima, que será el jueves 11 de marzo, esta vez a las 8 de la mañana, serán recopiladas en un libro editado por Juan Esteban Ugarriza y por esta servidora y que esperamos lanzar a mediados de año. Con eso creo que cumplo con la parte de la instalación. Simplemente quiero reiterar la gran alegría que siento de poderles dar bienvenida en esta fríísima tarde bogotana. Espero que quienes nos escuchen en otras partes del país o del mundo tengan una experiencia climática más grata en este momento. Me da muchísimo gusto darles la bienvenida a estas presentaciones que espero nos animen para pensar en este tema, para buscar formas rigurosas de aproximar la pregunta sobre qué es y cómo se estudia la reconciliación en las sociedades transicionales de las cuales Colombia forma parte y también para que a partir de esto logremos, ojalá, encontrar algunas salidas a las a veces amargas situaciones que nos plantea este contexto transicional, tanto en Colombia como en otras partes. Entonces, creo que lo voy a dejar por ahí por ahora. Buenas tardes, muchas gracias por el saludo, Pablo. Hola, Enrique. Sí, efectivamente, estamos grabando, entonces esto va a quedar todo disponible para eh, la posteridad. Creo que arranco entonces dándole en primer lugar una muy cordial bienvenida a Wilson López, al profesor Wilson López de la Universidad Javeriana y a la profesora Claudia Pineda de la Fundación Konrad Lorenz. Wilson es doctor en Psicología Básica y Social de la Universidad de Santiago de Compostela en España. Es catedrático actualmente de la Pontificia Universidad Javeriana y editor de la revista Universitas Psicológica. sido columnista de opinión en diferentes medios de comunicación en Colombia y dedica su investigación al estudio de los medios de comunicación y el conflicto y temas relacionados como el perdón, la justicia, la corrupción, políticas de drogas y diversos procesos ligados al conflicto colombiano. Claudia Pineda es doctora en psicología de la Universidad de Toulouse, en Francia, y actualmente es docente e investigadora de la Fundación Universitaria Konrad Lorenz en las áreas de psicología social, política y de la salud. Su investigación ha girado en torno a temas de cognición social y elaboración de juicios frente a fenómenos de relevancia social como el perdón, la reconciliación, las políticas de drogas y la corrupción, así como la toma de decisiones en contextos en los que se comprometen los juicios éticos. Wilson López y Claudia Pineda nos van a presentar su reflexión sobre el tema de preguntas y hallazgos empíricos del perdón y la reconciliación desde una perspectiva psicológica. Muchas gracias, Wilson y Claudia, por acompañarnos esta tarde. Gracias a todos y estamos al aire. Adelante.
Voy a compartir la pantalla y ahí se ve. Perfecto. Y ahora la amplío. Ya. Bueno, en primer lugar, muchas gracias a Advivoca, a Angélica, a Juan Esteban, a todos por la invitación. Pues yo además tengo un especial porque estuvimos algunos de nosotros en la primera diseño del primer instrumento del barómetro de la reconciliación. Entonces a mí me encanta saber que el proyecto sigue funcionando y porque creo firmemente que es necesario generar indicadores precisos y además contextualizados de temas como estos. Es decir, si no generamos ese tipo de indicadores, realmente a veces nos perdemos. Entonces, en primer lugar, después de estos agradecimientos a ustedes, quiero, perdón, como para que esto se cambie. Ahí. Quiero agradecer en especial al profesor Etienne Mulet, que es una persona que nos ha acompañado por muchos años en esta investigación, esta línea de investigación que lleva más de 16, yo creo que aproximadamente 16 años, a los estudiantes que han creído y acompañado todos los proyectos, a algunos colegas que nos han colaborado, nos han acompañado, a las comunidades y personas que han abierto pues las puertas de sus vidas para que nosotros nos acercáramos a tratar de explicar y comprender estos dos procesos que evidentemente en cualquier proceso de paz terminan siendo centrales, como son el perdón y la reconciliación. Quiero anotar otro tema, y es que evidentemente esto obedece entonces a una agenda de investigación, no es un proyecto aislado, sino es una agenda de investigación en donde nosotros hemos venido explorando la perspectiva de los actores. Entonces, pues tenemos investigaciones ligadas trabajando con víctimas directas, con víctimas que no son directas, con actores de la sociedad organizada, con medios de comunicación, con diferentes tipos de instituciones y con la sociedad indirectamente afectada. Y obviamente hemos tratado de aproximarnos en forma diferencial, dependiendo de, por ejemplo, el tipo de violencia a las que se han expuesto. En general hemos tratado además de abordar procesos que se cruzan. Entonces tenemos investigaciones asociadas a las comisiones de la verdad, a procesos de memoria, a procesos de justicia transicional, y en este caso, pues lo que vamos y a medios de comunicación, que es un área entera, cruzando estas variables, teniendo en cuenta siempre el tema de las consecuencias biopsicosociales que ha generado este proceso. En ese sentido, y lo hemos hecho, repito, como está ahí en esa slide, cruzándolo por una perspectiva diferencial, porque hemos explorado con diferentes grupos culturales y étnicos y seguimos en investigación tratando de explorar las diversas formas, los procesos de perdón y reconciliación con todos esos grupos y esa diversidad. Lo otro que quiero anotar es que estas investigaciones, antes de empezar a mostrarlas, tienen una perspectiva mixta en términos metodológicos, es decir, hemos utilizado desde entrevistas y investigación cualitativa y diferentes formas de investigación cuantitativa, desde instrumentos ya elaborados y validados para Colombia, como de lo que el fuerte para esta exposición de una metodología derivada del trabajo del profesor Mulet con el profesor Anderson, que se llama investigación por escenarios, que es básicamente basada en la teoría integral de la información. Y por otro lado, pues hemos explorado en particular todo el análisis de textos cuando hemos trabajado con medios. Digamos, recientemente sacó un paper sobre cómo los medios se habían trabajado el perdón y la reconciliación y encontrando diferencias para poder tratar de tener un mapa completo de esta perspectiva. La presentación la vamos a la estamos planteando desde un punto de vista a partir de un conjunto de preguntas, ¿sí? Y esas preguntas surgen, y repito, cuando surge estas líneas es porque empezamos a preguntarnos hace, repito, más como 13 años, 14 años, qué tanta investigación había desde el punto de vista de la psicología y preguntándole a la gente qué es lo que entendía por perdonar y reconciliarse, ¿no? ¿Qué se entiende por eso? Entonces encontramos cosas que a veces se contradecían con la literatura. Por eso la primera pregunta, y vamos a hacerla a dos voces esta presentación, es si usted no olvida es porque no ha perdonado de corazón. Y esto es importante contextualizarlo. Yo creo que yo he sido muy crítico, y los que me conocen lo saben, en que a veces en algún momento se empezó a girar en el discurso público la idea de que había que presionar el perdón y que la gente debería comprometerse a poner perdón para que pudiese llegar la paz. Y resulta que eso no, lo que vamos a ver es que no está relacionado, y como se dijo en la presentación anterior, además, la diferencia entre perdonar y reconciliarse es bastante, a veces, endeble en el discurso de las mayorías de las personas. Entonces, por eso es que vamos a mostrar todos estos detalles que creo que ofrecen muchos detalles que pueden ser importantes para los procesos de trabajo, de acompañamiento, de intervención con las comunidades y las personas víctimas directas o indirectas de nuestro conflicto armado. Entonces, ante esta primera pregunta, trabajando con esto, vamos a presentar los dos primeros trabajos cualitativos. Entonces le doy la palabra a Claudia.
Hola, muy buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Me uno a los agradecimientos del profesor
I
Wilson.
join in my acknowledgments by Professor Wilson, especially Professor Angelica, for this wonderful occasion to be able to share the lessons from our research. But to get to the point, what is it that Colombians told us that forgiveness meant? In this study, we found two main points, which are, let's say, not surprising, but they could give us some insights as far as the future. So Colombians spoke about replacing negative emotions, and they also spoke in terms of forgetting. This study showed, well, these two definitions came up in a study with the same frequency. When we asked people what was necessary to pardon, to forgive, they mostly spoke in terms of dialogue and ceasing of the offenses. As to what reconciliation means, they talked about restarting interaction and forgiveness, and equal to forgiveness. And to reconcile, you needed to have dialogue and that there be some kind of compensation. The next study that Professor Wilson will be presenting is on this slide. Yes, this had to do with victims of displacement. And it's really interesting because we found things that were quite similar at different times, but we found things that were quite similar in the discourse and the narrative that people provided in the interviews. But maybe what's most relevant that we find here, and I've always said that this inspired me to research, is that two matters stand out, to not dwell on everything else. And that is the religious matter, the thing about God and how God plays a very relevant role in forgiveness. There's a key saying there in that only God can forgive, and that's what people said. And I think that is also part of the research in Colombia. You do have to research the role of religion in our social fabric, as it were. And secondly, you must keep in mind that the victims, just like we've seen in various research efforts, do believe that it's necessary to forgive, but they associate forgiveness with forgetting. And there's a nuance there, because it's one thing to forgive personally, and then there's the the matter of forgetting politically what had happened. But forgetting appears here as a very important item, which is common to the work that we did with victims, with non-direct victims of the conflict. We asked a second question, which is no longer, let's say, well, we didn't exactly follow the same methodology, and the question is, do Colombians actually want to forgive? So here I would show you some details around the time aspect. We did this when the negotiations were underway with the paramilitaries, and a second study was done when the negotiations were taking place with the FARC. And this provides significant context because forgiveness, from our point of view, is a notion that can change. It isn't a particular feature of personality, but instead it changes. So we'll be seeing this in various research efforts. Claudia? Okay, so for this study, as the professor was saying, we used a methodology that is based on information integration. And to make a long story short, basically what it does is, what it proposes is that we do not make decisions based on a single point of information, but we look at various factors, and with that, then we make a decision. And in this case, as it pertains to our willingness to forgive, and I'll just explain this one scenario because from here on, we'll be looking at only the results because, well, basically the methodology remains the same. So we used a scenario where we proposed a story to people where these factors are combined. So for example, in this case, Luis Ramos is a former member of the guerrilla, and we talked about, and in some cases we talked about the guerrilla, and in other instances we talked about the military, the paramilitaries, and who committed various violent acts, naming people, and in some cases the crimes varied. Sometimes there was death, sometimes it was kidnapping, and these were planned by his superiors, and he was only obeying orders. So we spoke about in terms of responsibility as well. In other cases, we also addressed we talked about the person who actually planned the crimes. And now Luis wants to reintegrate into civil society, but he has never been introduced to the Garcia family to ask for forgiveness. So if you were a member of the Garcia family, what would you do? Next. Yes, and I would just add before you go on that all these studies are published in papers that we can send out if you like. Yes, so what I'll be presenting now is that in addition to the psychological standpoint, we also wanted to identify not just, let's say, the bulk of people are more or less willing to forgive, but also what factors are most important when it comes time to forgive. And we've also wanted to identify, let's say, groups of people who think similarly. And that's why we created a cluster analysis where we have found 4 main groups, 4 basic groups. So basically what we have found, or what we did find in the study in 2011, was that 40% of people who under no circumstances were willing to forgive. This is just to tell you that on a scale of 0 to 12, the median was 63, and that is 40% of our participants. Subsequently, if you look at the right, we have a group of 27% of people who are doubtful when it comes time to forgive, and there we find most of the population of our study. Next. So in 2016 and 2017, we did the study once again. Well, we repeated it and we added some things. But basically, what we did was carry out that same study, again, varying the various factors as being aggressor and perpetrators, and we added these other factors which are interpretable, where we again find one group of 29% of people who would not forgive, at least not with respect to 2011. And in 2011 it was 40. In this case it went down. 22% people that we call doubtful to forgive, or hesitant to forgive. There were 13% that were willing to forgive, depending on the circumstances. There was a 19% that said that they would forgive always, and a 17% of the group that was undetermined. This corresponds to people who have no specific pattern, but they're there like in the middle, that we don't know very well if maybe they didn't understand the methodology, but that just shows us that the others did understand. Next. Here, I think I should point out that there was a variation. That is, it's a minor variation in those who want to forgive. And in fact, with my French friend, we said this will definitely be really important in a referendum. and it's highly likely that the referendum will be lost because the willingness to forgive is something that was really out there in the media and advertising campaigns, and it was easy to drop that rate via campaigns. But anyway, the next question was then, well, with this question, we wanted to see if we could actually forgive the unforgivable. In this case, we know that over 55% of the victims have been women. So how do Colombians react? How would they react to the crimes against women? And it's clear that most of the women were unarmed. All of the studies show that. And according to the victims unit and others, it was over 4 million women who were unarmed and who were also victims. So for the methodology here, we only varied the type of crimes. These were specifically crimes against women, and the victims were women. And we found the results that we find here. Again, 5 clusters. Here, what's worth highlighting is that once again, we find a significant group of people who would not forgive, another group who is hesitant to forgive, and we found 2 clusters that show that, at least in the case of women, people forgive depending on the crime and depending on the attitude of the offender in this case. So these were the main findings we had under this study.
Entonces uno, pues nos preguntamos, ¿realmente
So then we asked ourselves, well, is this really a Colombian matter? Do we have any special characteristics? So we said, let's explore this. Let's explore forgiveness with other issues to see if it's actually something widespread. There's this very low willingness to forgive, as this study showed. So for this, we created a scenario where basically had the same content, the same factors as the previous, only this time, these had nothing to do with any political situation. These scenarios had nothing to do with politics. And we asked people, in a situation where there was medical negligence, how willing were they to forgive? If you read the scenario, well, you'll find that, once again, we have the factors around the seriousness of the damage, in this case, what the doctor did subsequent to the damage, and if the effects remained over time or not. And the results wonderfully show us, I would say, that it's not that we're not willing to forgive. In this case, only 15% would not forgive, almost under any circumstances. But the majority were found in this group of 55% that would forgive depending on the attitude of the offender. And also, 24% said that they would almost always forgive. And then we have that minor group of undetermined. So that's a relief. Yes, and that really showed us that the matter of forgiveness is focused more on the armed conflict. That is, the low willingness to forgive at all, considering the various factors, is specific to the armed conflict. So we asked ourselves, okay, so what about reconciliation? How does reconciliation work? So we investigated reconciliation as per the literature, since they're always associated. So reconciling, yes, but could you work then with that other person, or be their neighbor? So again, just like in previous scenarios, we did the same drill, only the questions changed. This says, how willing are you to accept, for example, living next to you in the same neighborhood? And we looked at the results found here. We found 5 clusters that we could interpret. And in these clusters, once again, we found a low willingness to reconcile, almost under any circumstances, a group of people who were hesitant, and just a small number of the participants said that they were willing to, well, in this case, they were willing to live in the same neighborhood, depending on the circumstances, whether or not the person asked for forgiveness or not, mainly. On this study, I would point out one thing. Next, please. And in this one, the results we'll look at in a moment. Were on the question if you were willing to work with the person you reconciled with. And time there was a lot of narrative around impunity. So what if they paid with time? So if you look at the paper, you'll find that there are no statistically significant differences in people in the willingness to reconcile if the person had done any jail time or not. So this is to question whether or not political stakeholders can question the transitional justice because basically people are not willing to reconcile or forgive under any circumstances in this case. The various studies show that the variable around asking forgiveness and trying to repair damages that does play a significant role in all the answers. Here, we also decided to explore what happened with ex-combatants. How did they feel around reconciliation? So we worked with a group of ex-combatants who were just about to leave jail, paramilitary and guerrilla, and we used a different instrument, also developed by Professor Mulet's team, adapted to Colombia. And we worked with 113 people in penitentiaries, former paramilitaries and guerrilla who were about to leave jail. This instrument looked at two main dimensions, one having to do with reconciliation, personal reconciliation, and the other is interpersonal reconciliation, intra and inter. So in this case, what they showed was, well, that we found high scores when it came to the capacity for self-control. And it is particularly difficult for homicide offenders to reconcile and forgive others. And most felt a moderate absence of fear, where a minority felt a considerable fear around security. So this allows us to conclude that the feelings around reconciliation for this case, when we analyzed social demographic variables, is very much associated with family supports. And in addition to that, these percentages, these scores rather, matched the rate of having participated in rehabilitation programs within the penitentiaries. And I would add two things to that. One is that ex-combatants that went through these programs in jail, they did show a greater willingness to reconcile. And the paramilitary ex-combatants, since they have more social networks, they were more secure than the guerrilla former combatants. And in fact, we're submitting a paper for a work we did in showing how there's a lot of fear in ex-combatant guerrillas for many variables, but I just wanted to point out those two things. And then we had to ask about transitional justice, about amnesty. Sorry, you have 2 minutes left. Okay, so thank you, Claudia. Yeah, so in this study, what we looked at was amnesty. This paper was is just out of the oven. In fact, it was published today. So this paper, what it looked at, if you can go back, yes. This one? No. No, before that. Well, I'll tell you in the meantime. What this paper looked at was whether or not it was more acceptable for people to have amnesty extended to certain people. And what we found was there were basically two main factors here. One is the quality of the information that person could provide who applied for amnesty, and the other had to do with restorative justice. That is, if the person wanted to engage in amnesty, they would ask forgiveness from the family and go through the whole process that we mentioned. And in one last study, yes, on the truth commissions, this basically said, yes, we want the truth, but what kind of truth are we to expect from truth commissions? And so this study basically showed us in the results that truth commission projects obviously demand the preservation of the truth, as its name implies, but also it should strengthen democracy and help to legitimize government agencies, and that when any of those things are not met, then some capitalize on that to say that truth commissions don't work or that they're not enough. because of course we all want the full project, but that doesn't mean that truth commissions should be considered as a bad project. And just to close, all this leads us to conclude that we definitely believe that we have to have a multidimensional approach for peace, where there are components that where there are various components coming together. And for this, I thank the organizers for having provided this space, because in general, most of the work has been done on economy for the past and for peace and rights around peace, and sometimes the psychosocial aspects are lost, because and that's really important because it does allow you to see the nuance. And in fact, we even included more studies, and we wanted to include even more studies, but time did not allow. But we definitely believe that this is an interdisciplinary issue, and that you have to have that same approach. And these studies should be based on this kind of evidence, which provides nuance that could be quite relevant when it comes time to intervene in the processes. Thank you very much for this time, and I think we made that time limit. Maybe we might have gone over a few minutes. Thank you. You flew through it, but that's okay. Thank you very much. Fantastic presentation. Very insightful for all these matters. I wanted to dwell on each subject, and I think we have many conversations ahead of us in this regard, so I'm very happy about that. I thank you very much for your presentation. If you could please stop sharing your screen, so we can now give the floor to Adriana Gaviria. She's an economist from Andes University with a master's in cultural studies, and she is finishing her doctorate degree in economy at Universidad Federal Fluminense in Brazil. She joined the Democracy Observatory at the Political Sciences Department in Andes University to look at peace and reconciliation, and she is now delving into many of the questions that these quantitative studies have resulted from the observatory, and will present the results. She has done studies on reconciliation from various standpoints, including how Colombians decipher reconciliation and what reasons explain the attitudes around coexisting with ex-combatants, and the psychological symptoms behind it, and how they affect attitudes to reconciliation. She'll be presenting a work on women in reconciliation, again, based on a qualitative analysis. Before giving the floor to Adriana, I would also remind you that we are joined by Juan Camilo Cárdenas, who is a professor of economy. He's a professor at the School of Economy. He was dean of that same school. He has a degree to that effect in the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and has worked in designing institutions that foster cooperation and resolve social dilemmas in the most just and sustainable manner possible. So I just wanted to tell you that. So after Adriana, we will hear from Juan Camilo. You are also very welcome to add your questions and comments to the chat. And as it becomes possible, we will ask the presenters to the questions and comments after the presentations. Okay, so very well. Go ahead, Adriana, and thank you for being here this afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Angelica. It's an honor to be here with Claudia and Wilson and Juan Camilo, who have also helped me extensively in these reconciliation studies. So it truly is an honor to be here. And what I will be presenting today really is the result of many years of thought at the observatory, not just my own, but also from colleagues, and especially women colleagues who address the annual reports on women, specifically Daniela Jaime, who is a co-author for this chapter, and she is also online, and Mariana Saldarriaga, who also engaged in a very important exercise to document what we found at the observatory on this issue. So the starting point for the study is an apparent contradiction between the relevance and the importance of having women stakeholders in reconciliation processes and what the studies show, observatory and elsewhere. So on the importance of women, and I won't dwell too much on this because this has been acknowledged internationally and domestically. The UN has acknowledged that women's active engagement is key in ensuring sustainability for peace and reconciliation in the world. And in Colombia, the peace agreement signed in 2016 also entailed a significant step in incorporating international standards for gender equity via 130 provisions seeking to acknowledge the disproportionate impact that the conflict had on women, especially sexual violence. And the Constitutional Court has also acknowledged that social violence or violence relating to the war has affected women on multiple fronts. And there's academic literature to the same effect. Here, I refer to one very important done by Ana Maria Ibanez, showing that in displaced homes, when the head of household is a woman, there's a higher risk of re-victimization and a higher vulnerability. And as I was saying, this importance contrasts with what the studies have shown that I'll be showing you in a second. So the question that we sought to answer with the study is, what is the explanation for the gap observed between men and women in terms of beliefs, attitudes, and opinions when it comes to reconciliation? And I'll be showing you the 3 steps behind this. So the first is, what do the surveys show? The second is, what can we learn from qualitative information to provide that answer? The answer to questions that the survey only to a certain point. They show us the reality, but the qualitative information is needed to take that extra step to see how we could interpret these results, these survey results, and definitely think they need further study. But we did find significant differences that I'll be sharing with you between men and women in terms of deciphering violence, the perceptions on justice, and interpreting the peace agreement. And why the peace agreement, if reconciliation and peace agreement are not the same things? Well, in reality, there's a study that we did at the observatory on the definitions of reconciliation, and also a qualitative study on how people understand, how Colombians decipher and understand reconciliation. And we found, and I can show you this in more detail on another occasion, but there are basically 3 dimensions under which Colombians understand reconciliation according to our results. And one is the social aspect, which basically is understood as rebuilding a country after war, where reaching agreements and abiding by them becomes key to reconciliation. So speaking of reconciliation in Colombia, does make you talk about the peace agreement. And there's a 3rd dimension that we have called the individual dimension, which has to do more about what my colleagues presented in a previous presentation on forgiveness and overcoming the rancor and the dissatisfaction, and how ex-combatants ask for forgiveness together with other perpetrators. So hence the peace agreement's presence in these thoughts on reconciliation. And lastly, we left some more questions. We ended up with more questions than answers on this step on, and now what? So what do these surveys say? So these are some figures showing how over time, how many men and women have answered the survey questions and have found it possible to achieve reconciliation from the demobilized FARC and paramilitary. And the clearest line, which is the line showing women, in every year, women have been below men when it comes to belief in forgiveness and reconciliation. Between 2000, even in 1 year, in 2008, we see those intervals never overlap. And what's most important in this chart is what happens as of 2014 or 2016, where this gap became wider. It became statistically significant and was maintained in 2018. So what happened in this period? Well, this is when the peace agreement was signed with the FARC, and the peace agreement began being implemented. So here again, we see that the process and that juncture of having signed a peace process the peace agreement, does affect this gap that we see between men and women on reconciliation. The good news that we find in this chart is that in 2020, it went away. That gap went away. So that's something that I really can't account for as it is today, but we do at least see that this is the closest that these beliefs between men and women on reconciliation have come. What else do the surveys show? Going on to the interpersonal take on reconciliation, this chart shows the ratio of men and women who have said that they approve having their kids study with ex-combatants in school. And this is around coexistence, where we find, once again, that there is a systematic difference between men and women. And in 2018, again, it was statistically significant. Other kinds of questions, for example, approval of the peace agreement and its components. We have found this difference between men and women systematically. Here we find simply one additional result, and that is the ratio of men and women who approve that the FARC participate politically. This is the lowest approval rating found out of all the components in the peace agreements, where we find also the widest gap between men and women in 2016 and 2018. And lastly, there's one important result under the observatory that I'd like to show you, and that is this is the ratio of men and women who, they were asked, what do you think is the best way out of the conflict with the guerrilla? Is it the negotiated military force or both? And here we find the ratio of men and women who prefer a negotiated end to the conflict. So we find this result really important because first it shows that it's most of the population, the majority of the population, both men and women prefer a negotiated solution. There are no statistically significant differences between men and women. And if there were, it would be women who mostly prefer negotiation than men. So I found this also important because it's not about women not supporting peace nor reconciliation, but that there's something in the process, in the peace process in Colombia, that has been interpreted differently between men and women, without that meaning that women don't want a negotiated end to the conflict. Another important result that I'd like to point out is that there were no differences in the ratio of men and women who were victims of the conflict. So these results could not be interpreted as women having a more negative view because they had more victimizing events against them, because that is not what the figures show at the observatory. Lastly, what do other studies show on this issue? So this included, in 2016, there was a study on peace and confirmed these results. Women do report feeling more upset than men about the possibility of coexisting with ex-combatants. They oppose the political participation of the FARC, and they believe less than men that their lives will improve after signing a peace agreement. Another study done by the Peace Research Institute in Oslo showed this initial study showing that women are less satisfied with the peace process than men, and they oppose political participation by ex-combatants more than men. And lastly, one study done by Corpo Visionarios, this is over 5 departments in 2017, also showed that women, when compared to men, had a lower likelihood of believing that forgiveness and reconciliation was possible. I have looked at the reconciliation barometer presentations, and I know that there are mixed results on this issue, and I'm just really eager to be able to explore this further and dive deeper into the dialogue. I didn't include other results because, well, I just wanted to include a few more slides, but undoubtedly this is really interesting in seeing how these results engage with the reconciliation barometer. So I'm very eager to see that. So what did we learn from the qualitative information to understand this gap? So before going into the results, I wanted to tell you that what we've done qualitatively speaking at the observatory. In 2017, we carried out annual studies, qualitative studies that guided the surveys. That is, we selected municipalities that were part of the statistical sample of the survey. And we've always done a qualitative work after the fact to look at certain issues that we'd like to dive deeper into. Today, the repository has focus groups up to 2020. However, for these results that I'll be presenting, we focused on 2017, 2018. with a total of 32 focus groups in 8 different cities. We went to 4 municipalities in each study, and under each municipality, four focus groups, separating men and women and adults and youth, so that we could have this systematic breakdown. And lastly, I would mention that given the nature of the studies, we were able to gather information from different Colombians in different cities and different levels of engaging in violence. In 2017, in one instance, they were the major cities like Bogotá and Cali, and the others were cadet municipalities. I would clarify that this study had a very rigorous systematization process behind it, done using in vivo software coding, which is where the repository lies at the observatory. And this was done using a code book so that we could have that traceability on the various categories under which we are grouping the information. And in the analysis, we sought to refine those categories via these emerging categories. We did frequency analyses as well as language analyses, which I will be focusing on especially today when showing the results in a moment. Language analysis means the ways in which men and women express themselves, the words they use, the references they have in mind when expressing their ideas. That's what we mean by language analysis. Here, then, you can see how the repository is organized in vivo, and the categories that we have are the sizes of the box sizes are the number of references when compared to the references found in the repository. We have information on a peace agreement. We have opinions on a peace agreement. We also have information pertaining to the reasons for the attitudes for ex-combatants. There are reports on this also published at the observatory. And today I'll be focusing on the opinions on the peace agreement for one very simple reason, and that is that that's where most of the references are found, and that allows for a more rigorous analysis, a more rigorous comparative analysis between men and women, because if there aren't enough references, it's not as convenient to break down between men and women. And also for the reasons I explained previously, in that the results are focused on the peace agreements as such. So what do the results show? First, let me summarize, and then I'll dwell on the whys of these results. So addressing the question, how the gap could be explained between men and women around reconciliation, we found 3 elements, and that is that women's narratives tend to be tend to contain more features having to do with a closer deciphering of the violence. This means both positive and negative opinions around peace and reconciliation, framed in a perspective of violence, even in people who have not been victims or have not been close to the violence. And I'll explain further in a moment. Second, they have a greater perception of injustice, especially when it comes to social inequality and the lack of reparations. And lastly, an interpretation of the agreement as being a political play that's convenient for certain groups that would not benefit the population that needs it most. That is, there's a lack of identifying specific benefits in the peace agreement. So when deciphering violence, we find references to specific victimizing acts and their effects. And I want to be clear here. This does not mean that this translates into negative opinions around peace, nor does it mean necessarily that people who have experienced war in the reference to victimizing acts. One example is this woman in Bogotá. When I hear families say that if they want forgiveness because they don't want their daughters to be raped and they don't want their children to be taken or killed or decapitated, with so many massacres that have occurred in Colombia, we're citizens and we didn't experience that. So when people say, yes, I want forgiveness and I don't want more war, then I agree. If they want it, why wouldn't I want it? And to show you what's behind this result, which is, again, the result of a systematic analysis. I'll show you that's the same message, but on the man side, just so you see what I'm referring to when it comes to language. A man here says on the peace agreement, it's imperfect peace, but it was either that or continuing to suffer the uncertainty of a car bomb or a guerrilla takeover. So the reference, there are changes in how they reference the victimizing acts, and they're much more specific when it comes to women. You have 3 minutes left. Okay, thank you. Another manner of looking at this is by word clouds, showing the frequency with which certain words appear in men's discourses and women's discourses. And in women, we find, for example, people is huge in both cases. In women, there are more references to words such as victims, farmers, reparations, massacres. And that's how they decipher more towards violence, whereas men say governments, FARC, political parties. So it's more of a distant concept around the victimizing acts than women. In terms of the perception of injustice, we find this to be focusing more on social inequality and reparations. And again, women detail the violent acts more so than men. This woman says on social inequality, those who were killed in massacres and bled the country out are receiving more benefits than those who caused terror. And the people who do well have been oppressed. Well, I won't read all the references, but again, we find that lack of reparations as standing out. And as for the peace agreement, we find a series. The peace agreement, we find a series of references having to do with the agreement being done with political goals in mind, that the president wanted to win the Nobel Prize. In fact, this woman says it was all a dog and pony show. But basically, they don't see themselves as beneficiaries of the agreement. So in conclusion, we see that gap. One of the first steps we can take to understand the gap has to do with the manners of violence and the effects that they have on people and families. The perception that in Colombia there's a lack of social justice and reparations, and the interpretation that the beneficiaries of the peace agreements are not the ones who need it most. That basically summarizes the results of the observatory. And now what question? Well, here we've proposed two paths. One is to further the research. We definitely need more studies and more diversity in information gathering and in analysis. We've done very rigorous work, but we are from Bogota. We are at private universities, and it would be great to see what other women in other contexts might have to say. And these studies should be done with scientific rigor and avoiding stereotypes. I was I was actually a little bit hesitant to present the results because we've always kept in mind that these kinds of studies cannot be translated into contrary messaging. It's more about providing insights. And we find that the factors that could promote reconciliation would be more women's engagement in reconciliation in the processes. It also has to do with tangible benefits, including reparations, and following through compliance, because there's a study by the Kroc Institute showing that the gender approaches in the agreements are especially delayed under the peace process. And lastly, any kind of intervention around social equity that would provide that blurring of the lines between victim and perpetrator would be useful. And in fact, the SENA, the National Learning Service, is providing education of public benefit to victims, to ex-combatants, to at-risk populations, without having to say in a classroom, I am a victim and therefore I am receiving this benefit. But instead, it's an opportunity to meld these differentiating factors all together. And that's important in reconciliation. And that's it. I didn't go over time. I hope not. Thank you very much, Adriana. Very stimulating, your findings. And also congratulations to Daniela for her engagement in this work. I'll give the floor now to my friend and colleague, Juan Camilo Cárdenas, to share his comments. And I will remind you that You can write in your questions in a chat box, and as well as your comments, so that after Juan Camilo's thoughts, we can address some of those questions and comments too. Go ahead.
¿No tienes privilegios para hablar? Auxilio.
Do you not? You don't have privileges to open your mic?
Alex, por
Help!
favor.
Tech support, Alex, if you would. I'm gonna cry.
Momentico.
1 second.
Andrea, ¿nos escuchas? Alex.
Andrea, can you hear us? Alex? Yes, I'm here. Don't worry. Yeah, we're working on the privileges. You can go ahead.
La conversación sobre privilegios está rara, pero no,
That's a strange conversation on privilege, but go ahead.
no tiene tono. Ahora sí.
Wait. Yes, there you are. There you are. Yes. Hi. Speaking of violence and privilege, Angelica, thank you. And Wilson, Claudia, and Adriana, thank you also for your presentations. They were quite provocative. And I have so many things to react to that I'm actually a little bit worried. How are we doing on time, Angelica? Because if you'd like to leave time for Q&A, I don't know how much you'd like me to comment. Maybe 10, 15 minutes? Okay. Okay, so I'll try and aim for 10 so that that does become 15, because I do have that issue. Okay, so just thank you very much, because it really is stimulating, very insightful what we've heard. And it also opens some very complicated windows on several issues. So I'll try to resume those, or to summarize those, because I think it ties together in many aspects, or they tie together in many aspects. Maybe I'd like to begin in supporting Wilson's recommendation that the psychosocial aspects be included in all of these issues, and maybe my reaction will be more on that, because that's kind of what I work on in cognitive sciences and behavioral sciences, and specifically the economy of behavior, which has been fed so much by psychology. And to that, I'll be speaking on a few points. Secondly, I would look at a dimension that we could call social and cultural. I think that Adriana also mentioned important things in that regard, and regarding gender, that we have to be very careful with, all of us do, as far as how we use evidence to build a discourse, because what Adriana presented is valuable, is controversial, and opens the door to many complicated questions on the gender approach and understanding processes of violence and understanding reparations, restoration, and reconciliation. And on that, I'll be speaking from the standpoint of behavioral sciences, and I would add maybe a few things for the discussion. So this cognitive behavioral element that we find, to that, I would simply say that when I hear these presentations and look at all this work, I think it takes us back to what we know today about human behavior. And I'll begin from the most simple to some more detail. And the most simple has to do with what has been commonly called in the most popular literature a simplification, which is it's a simplification that can be complicated, and that is around the cognitive process. System 1 and System 2 in the cognitive process of people. System 1 is that emotional, that quick response that happens with stereotypes and prejudices and emotions to be able to help humans to react, and to react to difficult or favorable situations. And System 2 is this component of the cognitive process that resorts more to more thought out and calculated and planned processes that allow for assessing the pros and cons and situations, that allow them to build future scenarios and allow the brain to pause to assess. And what we know today is that System 1 and System 2 interact constantly. Sometimes they conflict with each other, and sometimes they go hand in hand. And when looking at everything we've talked about, has a lot, and here I'll go into the details on one matter of human rationality, having to do with human preference under 3 key components based on what we've heard today. 1 has to do with the matter of risk, and risk aversion. The second is aversion to inequality, and the third is aversion to losses. Those three have been worked on when looking at behavior, to see how women, to see how men and women, to see how humans react to these situations. And that has a lot to do with what we've heard so far about the processes of violence that have caused huge losses in victims, and that we are now hoping to build reconciliation both individually and collectively, that dialogue with the human issue of dealing with System 1 and System 2. So sometimes System 1 tells us on one ear, I'm angry, I lost a lot, and I am adverse to inequality and loss. And to add to my attitude to risky situations, violence could make me even more risk adverse. So the System 1 will emotionally place me against many of the reconciliation and forgiveness processes, reparation processes, either as a victim or as a perpetrator. And this is obviously associated with Kahneman and Tversky's theory of prospection. But there are other aspects having to do with virtues, character and virtues. Speaking in Peter Zelig-Zeligman's take on virtues. And in this case, the virtues would be empathy and forgiveness as human virtues, with which, when associated with System 2, we can observe and foresee everything that society might gain with the possibility of personally building a road toward those virtues. But let's recall that System 1 and System 2 are sending signals to the brain permanently that are telling us as a negative reaction, as a strong negative reaction to violence, why it's so difficult to forgive and why it's so difficult to, via empathy, create a reconciliatory process. So when I put all of that together, and here I would like to tie this with the matter that Adriana showed us on the difference in genders, we find several important things. One of them has to do with the fact that today we have some consolidated and robust evidence around differences in gender and these preferences around loss and inequality. The behavioral literature shows that systematically women are more risk adverse than men. That's one thing. Second, regarding pro-social aspects, be it altruism, trust, reciprocity, inequality aversion, there is no robust evidence when it comes to the differences between men and women. On risk, there is, but not there. And one important third point, you might have heard of the study from Professor Andres Moya at Andes University at the School of Economy on how trauma associated with violence exacerbated risk aversion in people. So if we put this onto a cocktail where women are more risk adverse and less tolerant to risk situations, and considering how violence exacerbates risk aversion, we can find the reasons for Adriana's results on these differences between gender, or at least rather between men and women specifically, as it pertains to risk, situations of risk and violence and loss. So having said all that, I did a few lookups here, and I found some meta-analyses around 70 studies around forgiveness from Miller, Everett, and McDaniel from 2008, where they mention that as a result of this meta-analysis of 70 studies, that women, in fact, would seem to be more able to forgive than men, which contrasts with what we were finding here under Adriana's data. So, and just because Wilson mentioned this, he asked whether or not Colombians are weird in this regard, somehow strange, and And that thing that we think of ourselves as different from anyone else, that's really specific. And there are many things to be considered, but obviously the context does provide for a more serious situation. But there is something to study here when it comes to the possibility of forgiveness or not. So I'll close by saying that because of this matter of gender, we will indeed have to further explore how to build, considering that women are more prone to being victims, and this is difficult in certain cases, and we saw this in the studies, these direct field studies around the possibility of reconciliation, and the difficulties that households have, single-parent households or women heads of households, where women are more likely to be victims of violence. There we find a very difficult crossroads. It's a crossroads around how to build reconciliation when there are behavioral aspects that are different between genders, but that could also cover the largest number of victims, considering all the factors I mentioned, having to do with risk aversion and inequality aversion and loss aversion, as found in these behavioral approaches. I would imagine that listening to women's voices more and further will be key in being able to build the kind of, or create the kind of discourse that have a better effect in society. And I found those testimonials fascinating under Adriana's study. Obviously, when you extract phrases from focus groups, you're looking for the phrases that show that contrast, but with that, you gather more information from meta-analysis and text analysis, as well as statistical analysis via experiments and surveys. But what I find here is that the challenge really lies, or rather, the challenge is really complicated, and that could be addressed by hearing more from women's voices to better understand how the related cognitive processes would seem to fall more on system 1 than system 2. But this would allow us to create a discourse and find those virtues around empathy and forgiveness when there are emotional processes behind them that place very strong barriers up and that are mediated by the issue of gender. I think there's a great discussion to be had, and we can address the two presentations we heard on that at this point, and I'll stop here. Thank you very much, Juan Camilo. Before giving the floor to Wilson, Claudia, and Adriana to react or respond, I would like to, first of all, mention that my co-author and colleague, Juan Esteban Ubarriza, placed some of the preliminary findings that we have based on the reconciliation barometer under ACDI VOCA, which also has contributed to the conversation. And I think we agree with Juan Camilo and Wilson and Adriana that this is indeed super complicated, and there are no clear lines around identity as to what could be expected from reconciliation. And public policy will have to be specific to population groups in that regard. And that's what we're also trying to engage in our beacons for reconciliation that we saw in the previous presentation last week. I'd like to ask one question that Felipe Hernandez wrote in the chat, and it is, how does the socioeconomic situation and geographic situation influence in the results, especially in people who were kidnapped? The question is more for Adriana, but I think Wilson and Claudia can also address it based on their studies. So I would ask Claudia and Wilson to first respond, then Adriana, and then Wilson, if you like, you can react to Juan Camilo's observations. So first, should I start? Yes, you already started. Go ahead. Okay. Well, I just wanted to point out that, yes, it is necessary to research and we're working on a project to this effect on the matter of memory and its effects on many of these processes. You do need to look at memory. The thing is, it is costly, it is expensive, it is difficult. We have a project again underway. It was recently approved, and we'll see how we can work it out with Felipe de Brigar. And Paulo, who's around here, also is engaged, and it's about memory. together with reconciliation. And hopefully that project will provide a series of neuroscientific data points that could be quite robust. I would point out then that there are obviously some contextual permanent variables that all studies have shown and that all analyses have shown, and that is that if conflict is not stopped, if reparations are not had, if violent acts are reactivated in certain areas where there's violence, well, then it's really difficult for people to change their beliefs. And in fact, our methodologies, and I'll let Claudia speak because I know she's super eager to talk about that because we were talking about that on privately here, is decisions. Well, when you ask someone in interviews, yes, okay, this, that, but what exactly are the details? I mean, in the first study, just to mention one thing I couldn't mention before, and in the first study with the paramilitaries, we asked about forgiveness for the paramilitary, and it was quite a low rate of forgiveness. And we asked why, if the peace process was so legitimate. And then with the FARC, it was lower, but there was also a significant factor in communications, in the media, in both cases. So there's a real effect from the media, and there are very strong effects in the media in changing these opinions. And here, of course, there are cultural elements that are at play that we also have to explore and that I think have not been explored enough. And it's the matter, for example, of family and family dynamics and how they affect reconciliation and everything else, not just in women either, but what happens there. We still see the family aspect as being huge. And then there's a matter of empathy. Juan Camilo, there's a recent study from a colleague in Ireland who found that in Ireland, empathy was used to cause harm, even. That is, they used it, the various actors used it, so if I know how you feel, they would use that as a weapon of war. So I say you have to be careful because sometimes you deposit hope in certain issues. You know, let's have more empathy, for example, but it turns out that empathy, just like Juan Camilo pointed out, you know, emotions play differently. That's when that's something to be really looked at. Now to the question, yes, there are obviously differences, but the thing is when we find common ground, because we have, I mean, you've seen this. You can read the literature. There's over 16 years using multiple methodologies, exploring these same issues, and you find many irregularities, or many regularities rather, many commonalities. I just wanted to point that one thing out. Thank you, Wilson. Claudia? No, I just wanted to add to what the professor was saying in that our methodology seeks to, well, it clusters people who answer similarly. So when they answer the question, there's a pattern that we have roughly identified having to do with people where there are higher levels of education, they consider more factors when deciding to forgive. That is, it's not that they forgive more or less, but rather that they consider more of the context in that decision making. And that is similar to other studies that have been done elsewhere. And that's kind of a match that we find. That's what I would add regarding that specific question. Thank you. And as you can see in the chat, the discussion on gender and the question on whether or not we're talking about structures that cause those differences is quite lively. So I think we should even have another event focusing on gender when it comes to reconciliation, because clearly there are many more details to explore. Before giving the floor to Juan Camilo, I'd like to first give the floor to Adriana. Thank you. Well, to the question on how socioeconomic and geographic conditions affect, I can answer that based on other studies that can really address that question. And it's really, the result is quite evident. The closer you are to violence, the closer you are to reconciliation. We see this in podet municipalities versus non-podet municipalities, which is one of the studies under the observatory. We have also found, for example, that just in women in rural areas really support peace and reconciliation much more than in urban areas. And one recent study we did that Angelica knows about, we found that despite victims and as people report more violence in their families, they're having experienced more violence, and despite that the severity of the violence affects the psychological malaise that people feel, despite all that, the victims are more willing to reconcile and to coexist with ex-combatants. So that's another study, but what it shows is that the exposure to violence would seem to have a positive effect on reconciliation. On the matters that Juan Camilo mentioned, that's a whole research to be done there, because everything he said is fascinating around behavior, and we could definitely dive deeper in those results. Juan Camilo? I was just going to use one example. I mean, Claudia mentioned one thing about education, which I found really interesting, because not just for this case, but for many other cases, and I'll give you one example. When you look at the data on discrimination, ethnic or racial or gender discrimination, where you ask people, how much do you agree with a phrase such as, women are not made to hold high positions, or that indigenous women should not have high level positions because they're lazy. Those, the rejection or acceptance of those kinds of phrases, the level of education, with less education, that discrimination goes way down. And Claudia mentioned, in fact, that the willingness to forgive might have a positive association with education. And economists always say, well, that information is not consolidated. And with all these studies, we are permanently seeing, we're always running that risk of finding correlation, and not meaning that we could find causality, including the case of gender differentiations. The grand majority of the population, not all of it, but most of the population, is born with, let's say, a declared biological sex, man or a woman, and they keep that through their lives. Not everyone does. There are people who choose to change it. But in that sense, that doesn't mean that just because you see a statistically significant determining factor between one and the other, that doesn't mean that there is an essential determinism in between the groups. And that's what we were proposing, in fact, in the chat. And the same goes for education. It doesn't mean that educating more of the population means that we'll have more reconciliation per se, because it could be strictly endogenous. It might even be inverse. There might be people who are more willing to forgive because they are families that value their children's education, and education might be a consequence of the fact and not a cause. So this is all to say that, and all these systems that we're addressing, we always have to take care to not attribute causality to correlation. While we struggle with the data and struggle with the methods, and that's why we experiment, because with experiments we can try to explore more causality than correlation, but it's a really complicated challenge. Hence the study I mentioned from Andres Moya regarding violence, that makes people more risk adverse. It's interesting because in that study, you can prove some causality in the sense that violence caused more risk aversion, and more risk aversion leaves us in a very difficult situation when it comes time to find reconciliation, because reconciliation in a poverty trap where I am very reluctant to leave my safe space because I'm a victim of violence, that creates that poverty trap. And in this case, it's a trap to make it that makes it more difficult to leave because of the violence. Thank you, Juan Camilo. I see also in the chat we have Pablo is still contributing his thoughts. Thank you very much. I don't see any more questions though for now. I'd like to give each of you the opportunity for some closing words. And with that, we would conclude today's session. So let's begin with Claudia Pineda. Well, just once again, I just want to reiterate my gratitude for having invited us to share in this knowledge. Like Professor Wilson said, it's been many years of work in these kinds of studies. And in fact, Professor Wilson was my professor at Javeriana University, so it's a pleasure to be able to join him here now from a different point of view, different standpoint with these presentations. Angelica, also thank you very much. You were also my professor, and it's fantastic to be able to share this space with you. Undoubtedly, I think the challenge is indeed huge, and one great thing after all these studies, not that they're over, because in fact, we have about 4 papers who are in the process of being published. But I think we've also reached an interesting point in which we've been earning trust to create psychological programs that will allow us to have an impact on the populations that we have always addressed to get to know them. So I know that in the case of Professor Wilson, that is also the case, but in our case, we just concluded a study with the Changing the Story organization, or the Changing the Story project, where we work with the youth. And in fact, right now we have another project underway under Ciencias at a National Historical Memory Center that we are implementing, where we are implementing strategies with the youth from an artistic standpoint to also enable change in their skills and peaceful coexistence and reconciliation. So I think this is a point that capitalizes on all of these theoretical exercises. So I'm just really thankful to all of you and to Juan Camilo for your comments. And like Angelica said, I wish we were in a personal space where we could have some very large, we could have a lot of coffee to continue to discuss these issues in person. It was great to see the studies that are underway, and well, I'm just very thankful, and just thank you very much. Wilson? Yeah, so many things, so many insightful things. And when you've been researching over 10 years these issues in so many ways, it becomes difficult to kind of tie it all together. Hopefully, you'll be seeing a new being published under the APA where that I wrote, where there's a whole chapter on how these various dimensions come together in these studies. We also have a project with Pablo here, who's very active, to work in Montes de Maria with the Newton Fund. It's a science fund where we will work on mental health for 3 years, and that's really what I'm taking away from this and from other studies, where, for example, people say that no, there are no mental health issues, and people can say many things, but something that has been determined, something that we found in Colombia, is that people think we don't have mental health issues. So people say, I don't have a mental health issue, but I have a serious drug problem or a serious alcohol problem. So like Camilo said, we have to nuance these studies, and that's what these things help us with when it comes time to reach conclusions. And I think that this is why we've tried to maintain this research, this line of research over the long term, which is what I find interesting. And this doesn't mean that we have permanent financing, but with this study that we started with Claudia, still at the university, all the way to the study that we are now concluding, it's been 14 years, something like that, right? 12 years, 13 years of studies. So I find it interesting to look at how these issues evolve over time and how the various elements come and go together. I think the interventions should be multidimensional, should be multi-professional, and that's another issue that we find here when working with various stakeholders. I mean, today we're in this meeting involving certain projects, and we find how this is similar to that. And sometimes we don't just talk to each other. We don't have these open spaces to actually have a conversation and share the results, which might be quite useful together with public policy, and not just public policy, but also communities, with the communities and with the various stakeholders. So I think in general, these kinds of scenarios, this dialogue are essential at every level, because again, that's the issue. Sometimes we speak over here, but we don't speak with the community, or public policies is elsewhere. And it's really difficult that way, Juan Camilo. And it makes you lose hope, because if policy goes one way, the academia goes another, and the stakeholders go another, you find these results that might be, that could make you lose hope. But I think we have to continue to work in that manner. And that's it. I'll just stop there. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, Angelica, and to Esteban and everyone else. Thank you, Wilson. Adriana? Thank you. I just wanted to really thank all of you for the invitation, to Claudia, Wilson, Juan Camilo for your comments. And I would just reiterate the message. I'm looking at the chat here. I would just reiterate the message that the studies on gender do have to take place with a feminist approach, taking care to avoid any pitfalls. So they have to be addressed very carefully. And just to add to what Juan Camilo mentioned, another result I found from Moya had to do with the effects on hope that people have. So it would also be interesting to look at that, because one of the references I showed you, one woman told us there's never been justice and there's never going to be justice. So maybe we could dive deeper into the matter of hope. And well, thank you all for your questions and your comments. Thank you, Adriana. Juan Camilo? No, I wouldn't have much to add apart from what we've heard today from Claudia and Adriana Wilson. This is really enriching and very provocative. It actually opens up to more questions than answers. I would just close by saying that this matter of peace building, that poor term that's been so deteriorated and that has suffered so much, and which Angelica has led in her initiatives for peace building and keeping hope, and that's why we mentioned hope. We have to keep that term peace building in high regard, despite how much it suffered in public discourse. And this means collective engagement, and that's why we have to understand what peace means as it pertains to reconciliation, and not just peace as a matter of security. I think that term has been quite distorted in a discourse, and therefore we must understand emotions and feelings and rationality and how it is collectively built. And it's not an easy matter. It does have to be interdisciplinary, and I congratulate all the researchers today because of their various approaches and methodologies to try and weave a more comprehensive take on the issue. And hopefully we can recover the word peace and give it the status it deserves in this country's discourse. Great words to conclude, Juan Camilo. Thank you very much, Wilson, Claudia, Adriana, Juan Camilo, for your contributions this afternoon. Thanks to all of you for your attention. And again, this is part of a project that will be an edited book that we hope to have in the coming months. And this event is also recorded in case you'd like to review it or share it. Thank you all very much and have a great afternoon. And this is as far as we went. Have a great night.
Feliz noche.
Wilson, que te vaya bien, gracias.
Wilson, I hope you're well. Thank you.